Jeff Browning, good buddy. Welcome to the Free Trail Podcast. Nice to see you.
Thanks, brother. Good to be here.
It's been a long time coming, man. Like I said to you in our text exchange, you're definitely, if not the most requested guest, you're in the top 2 or 3. So it's been a long time coming. I'm glad to find
I'm honored to be on for sure.
Glad to finally get you on the show. Maybe first just fill the audience in about what you were up to this weekend. It seemed like you were doing an uphill race on your local mountain, which is far removed from your wheelhouse as the world's best 100-mile racer, perhaps. So what were you doing this weekend?
Well, there's a big fundraiser here locally, a big local event at Arizona Snow Bowl that Catula sponsors. And it's an uphill challenge, and it's got 2 courses, a short course is like a mile, and then a 3.5 mile course with like about 2,100 feet of climbing. You just basically, there's 2 divisions. There's the ski division, so you can, do like a ski mountaineering type of setup. And then there's like a traction division. So my ski-mo setup's more of a backcountry setup, so it's not very light. So I opted to do the traction this year and jumped in it. It's a 46-minute sufferfest because you go right up a ski run, like multiple pitches. So it's 2,100 feet of climbing and probably a little over a mile, 1.5 maybe.
Yeah.
And straight up a ski run. And it's a mass start. So you're with the skiers. So Krar was on skis and I was on traction, and he and I were like right next to each other on the climb. And then when I passed him, he was in the lead in the ski division. I was maybe in like at that point, like 9th in the traction division. So we top out, he's transitioning and getting his skins off. I blow by him, and then he blows by me skiing. And then as soon as he did, I was like, ski, that looks really fun to go down.
Yeah. That's a performance enhancer going downhill on skis.
So, and I love to ski, man. I skied this morning with my son, and I ski twice a week this time of year. So,
cool.
And I do a little backcountry here and there. I mean, the backcountry here can be questionable just because we get such long windows between storms. The backcountry get junky.
Yeah.
So I'll go out a little. I'm starting to meet a few guys who can kind of guide me out. You got to find the locals, man, because nobody tells you where they're stashed.
Well, I was going to ask you, like, how are you settling into Flag? Because, obviously when you and I met back in the day, you were living in Bend, and then I know you tried out Utah for a bit. You tried Montana, and now you're in Flagstaff. I've been sort of bouncing around myself with our little family. So how's it feel to be settled in Flag?
It's good. Like we got our kids settled in first, and they've got all their friends, and now my wife and I are settling in now. So we had this uphill challenge, man. It starts and finishes at Fremont Bar at like the base, and it starts at like 5 p.m. So, the whole resort crowd's moved out, and it's all just locals hanging out. It's all the local endurance community. And so it was really fun, for me to be in that scene. I finally have a circle of people. And so we all had a table, and, I felt like, wow, I'm like, I was sitting back, like got done racing, changed, and people already saved me a table. It was awesome. I'm like, I felt like I belonged.
You're part of the community.
Yeah, it was good. It was
amazing.
Really
good, man. Well, hey, you and I have known each other for a long time, and I'm really excited to have you on the show. And I have so much that I want to talk about, but I figure first, maybe we start by talking about your roots, because I'm not sure I've really ever gotten the full story about where Bronco Billy came from. I know you're from sort of rural Missouri, but I wondered, just sort of like how that part of your life has sort of shaped the person you are, just kind of growing up in the Midwest, far flung from the Mountain West, where you've sort of at least spent the last couple decades of your life. What sort of values were instilled in you in those years in Missouri, and what's carried over into who you are now?
Well, definitely hard work, man. Work ethic. I grew up on a 700-acre family farm. We had livestock and crops, corn, soybeans, and wheat. What I'd consider the devil today, but that kind of like monoculture farming, because I'm all about like regenerative agriculture and regenerative ranching, and supporting those things. But I grew up in that, and one of the things that goes along with that is hard work. I was I had to paint our farmhouse when I was 12 years old. That was my dad assigned me that project. I'd never painted anything. So, it took me all summer to paint our house.
Yeah.
We had to scrape it and be on a ladder all summer, and 12-year-olds, we aren't very good workers. So we aren't very efficient at our work. So it took me all summer to paint our house. But I ran a hay crew in high school where I had all my buddies were on my own crew. So, and we put stuff away at night. So because when it wasn't as hot. So, and we had to get things in before thunderstorms. So if we had a field full of bales, like we had a trailer and a truck, and then we were out running a truck and trailer at like midnight, when it wasn't hot.
Yeah.
And then we'd have to put it away in barns, up in the hay lofts and stuff like that. So, I castrated pigs. I've done it all, man.
Yeah.
I've had my hands pretty dang dirty, and rode 3-wheelers, and I was pretty awesome riding a wheelie on a 3-wheeler. I could ride like a quarter mile on a 3-wheeler down a gravel road.
Oh my goodness, man. You're lucky to be alive.
I know, man. We were crazy. I mean, and we drove muscle cars in the 80s. So like I had a 67 Mercury Cougar with like dual glass packs and a 289. And, and so like, it was like, I'm 51. So I graduated from high school in 1990. And so the 80s were like, it was 4,700 people in a small farming community 60 miles east of Kansas City, just out of the Missouri River Valley and up in the hills. And that's what I grew up doing, man. I was always outside. I grew up with a grandfather who farmed my dad, and my grandfather was really probably my biggest outdoor mentor. He took me on nature hikes like quite often. At that point in my life, when I was younger, my dad was always working on the farm and he was running the farm. And my grandfather kind of taken a back seat a little bit. And so he had a little more free time, and he would take me out on a lot of nature hikes all over our farm. We had a lot of like creeks and stuff like that. And he really showed me and taught me like, hey, that's a coyote's den, and that's fox tracks, and, deer tracks, and just kind of like, generally introduced me to appreciate nature. And I hated being inside. Like I was always outside. I was the kid, like as soon as I was home from school, I was outside until I was called in. We had a big dinner bell. My mom called it a dinner bell, but it was from the old one-room schoolhouse that my grandfather had gone to. When they closed that thing down, they auctioned off a bunch of stuff, and my parents got the original school bell. And my dad mounted on a big white wood post out our back door. And when it was lunchtime on the farm, my mom would come out and just ring the bell, and that was the lunch bell.
That's like stuff from the movies, man. That's like legitimate farm living.
It was, dude. I drove tractors. I was driving cars by the time I was 12. Like by the time I was 13 or 14, I was sliding vehicles around corners sideways like the Dukes of Hazzard. My dad would call the CB and tell my mom, hey, I need this tool from the shop. I'm at this, we had all these like 40, 80 acre fields all over the place. And some would be like 4 or 5 miles away, and I'd have to drive gravel roads to get there. And I was 13 or 14, but I'd been driving since I could see over the dash. And so he would just say, send Jeff down here with the tool. I'd jump in the truck, and that was my opportunity to be the Dukes of Hazzard, man. And I was like, whoa. I was driving a stick. I already knew how to drive a stick by 13 or 14, It was fun. Good times.
That's amazing. How old are your kids now, Jeff?
So my oldest, Ben, is 20.
Wow. You've got a 20-year-old son.
20, Annie's 17, and Abraham's 11.
Amazing, dude. So I'm sure you've obviously recognized the value that hardworking upbringing has brought into your life. Is there ways in which you've tried to convey that to your children throughout the years?
I have, but I would say that I probably spoiled them more than I should have, just because I grew up in a time when the 70s, farming was really good for the small farmer, and the 80s were horrible. So my junior high school years were always met with, nope, we can't afford that. And so as I had a successful graphic design business, and the coaching business has been really been doing well. And I like to give my kids good gifts. So
Yeah.
sometimes my wife gets on me because I'm a little too lenient on that side of things. But I would say that they are good, solid workers. Like my son, has assistant manager position, works full time. He saved a bunch of money. He took a gap year because it was during COVID. He was a senior. Senior year of high school was COVID. And
brutal.
And what it would have been his freshman year of college. And he took a gap year. He worked full time, put a bunch of money in savings, and now he's doing an online intensive school to become a draftsman. It's like CAD. So he's working like 55 hours a week right now. So he understands how to work hard. And I try to instill that in them. So they do a good job. But
yeah,
you can't replace being on a farm.
Yeah.
Like where you have to get up, you have to work every Saturday for 8 to 10 hours. Like even when I was in junior high and high school, like all my buddies were doing something on a Saturday and I was castrating pigs, or we were moving cattle, or, I was driving a grain truck and during harvest, I was driving the big old 60s, like with manual power steering, power steering. My grandfather called it Armstrong power steering.
Well, I'm sure that you look back fondly on those days, and I'm sure your children, pick up that the value of hard work through osmosis, at least, and also from observing your professional athletic career. To what extent do they care about what you do and what you've achieved athletically?
They've grown up only knowing me running 100 milers. So I ran my first 100 Western States in 2002 when my 20-year-old was in the womb. Yeah. So 3 weeks from delivery. We didn't know it at the time we were that close. He came a little early. And so we were like pretty surprised. 3 weeks later, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm a dad. But that's all they've known. So for them, it's normal, I guess, that this lifestyle that I lead is dad running a bunch of ultras every year and that kind of stuff. But they've also seen my success in it. And I say the one that's the most probably he's in a little bubble is my youngest, because it was in my latter, more successful part of my career. So he expects me to win. Like when I go in to enter a race, he's like, did you win? Why didn't you win? If I don't win, he's like, why didn't you win? So, but they see it and they see how hard I work and,
because you were really a late bloomer too. I mean, you didn't start really getting into trail and ultra running until you were sort of in your early 30s. And then your career took off when you were sort of in your 40s and now into your early 50s. And
40s really took off for sure.
Yeah. Well, let's get into that in a little bit. One of the things I'd love to also hear you talk about, and that I think the audience would really love to hear, is your relationship with Karl Meltzer, because I know you guys have known each other obviously for a long time. I think you're good buddies, or at least you have a lot of mutual respect for one another. So maybe tell the story about how you and Karl met and how that relationship has evolved.
I think we met through Ultraspire, because we were both Ultraspire athletes, and they did some team things in the early days where we all kind of met up someplace and hung out for the weekend. And Karl and I immediately clicked. He and I, we share similar adventure and, the love of adventure and just chilling, you know what I mean? Like he knows how to chill. I know how to chill. We're not super high strung when it comes to that kind of stuff, but willing to do big adventures. And I think, he and I went out once and did half of the Zion Traverse on one of those outings together, just the two of us. And that's where probably the first time we ever, if I can remember right, I think that's the first time we ever went out and ran a decent amount together. And then from that point forward, anytime we could connect and we were, going to be at the same race, if we were going to be at Run Rabbit, we'd ask Fred if we could share a place, and we get a condo together. We've met up in Texas at races for Bandera one year, and shared hotel rooms. So we've had some good times together. And we every time I win 100, he always he he says good job, but he rubs it a little bit. He turns the screws because he's got the lead, and he's got such a lead.
So fill the audience in of what you're talking about here. It says the overall 100-mile victory list, and I'd love to know what the standings are.
Career 100-mile wins. Carl has 47, and I have 27. So I'm second in the world. I surpassed Ann Trayson a couple years ago. She was she was 22 for her career. Yeah. And I didn't even know that stat, but of course Carl does. Carl knows all the stats, right? He's literally like a sports announcer, that can just pull stuff out of his head. So he's like, he put it on my radar when I was one away from Ann. Yeah. And he was like, you're about to move into second behind me. And I was like, what? And he's like, yeah, Ann has 22. And so when I surpassed Ann, then it started from that point forward, it was really on my radar. Yeah. Once he put it on my radar. And so now, he thinks I've got the potential to be in the 30s for sure. Yeah. But he's like in another stratosphere, dude. Yeah. I mean, he was running 600s a year in the 2000s when it was a smaller sport, less competitive. I mean, some of my times at Hard Rock, if I look back right, I think some of my fourth place finishes would have won Hard Rock so many times. And when he was winning it, he was running at about that time that I ran for fourth. So, performance wise, I'm really close to what he ran as far as his fastest. I can't tell you exact stats, but I mean, that just shows you when Jurek was winning all his Western states, some of those times would barely be in the top 10 now. Yeah. To put in perspective how fast it is now. Yeah. And I want to get more into how things have changed and progressed during your couple of decades in the sport, but maybe lingering on this topic of Karl Meltzer, I'd love to just maybe if there's any examples, anecdotes of competition or conversation between the two of you, because I think the audience would love to just sort of be a fly on the wall in the interaction between you two iconic 100-mile legends of the game. Is there anything that comes to mind, at a race or even just a training run, the two of you, that you think would be a funny story? We've always been close to each other, especially in that 2012, 2015 range. We were at Run Rabbit in the early days, and he got second, I got third. And we were together the first 35, 40 miles together. And I remember went back, it was at a different course, but used to come down for Fish Creek Falls on the road, and we were hauling. It was a downhill road. It was the early days of Ultra, and Ultra was filming another runner. I can't remember who the runner was, but it was the three of us running, and they had a truck. And cameraman was hanging on the outside of the truck filming us. And Carl and I were right next to this guy and just running it was Josh Arthur. And so we're running right next to him. Right. And this might've been 2013. And we're hammering, man. I look down and we're running 6:30 pace, and we're at mile 20 something of the 100, but the camera's on us. So we're hauling and no one's going to let up because the camera's on us. So, but we hammer that into town. Carl and I stay together. I think at that point we lost Josh, and then he and I climbed up Emerald Mountain. And at the top of Emerald Mountain, he kind of topped out before me, and he gave me a wink at the top and took off. And that's where he got his gap. I had a bonk. I bonked in that spot a little bit, and it was hot that afternoon. It was south facing downhill, and I came to that aid station. I just had a rough patch. When you have one of those 4 or 5 mile rough patches, and then if you were with somebody, that's when they gap you. Yeah. And so from that point, the rest of the race, I was 20 minutes back the entire race, and I never could make the gap back up. But he knew that I was back there. He had crew and stuff, and they were telling him Browning's 20 minutes back. Browning's 20 minutes back. So he's running scared for me. I'm trying to catch him. And we had a good laugh afterwards. There's actually some photos that came out of that because Fred Marmsader was at that race taking photos for Patagonia at the time.
Well, shout out Speed Goat. It's fun to hear the stories of YouTube grizzled vets going after it. Years, it's funny. I'm not sure I've really told this story, at least on the podcast, but you mentioned Run Rabbit. I was there for the inaugural the inaugural 100-mile race there.
That's right.
I was in the lead through mile 70, and then Carl comes into an aid station right behind me, chugs a Red Bull, trots out before me, and I never saw him again. And it was like the ultimate textbook learning experience watching the 100-mile master and Carl Meltzer pass you at mile 70 of a 100-mile race. It was fantastic. But going back a little bit further, I'd love to hear you recount some of the stories from early in your career. Like, you've done 150 ultras at this point, right?
I've done almost 200 at this point.
Wow. I mean, I've done, I think like 65 or 70, and I feel like a grizzled veteran, and I'm not even halfway to the aggregate total of Bronco Billy. So I don't know if there's, from like maybe one of your first 2 or 3 races, like is there a moment or an anecdote that you still think about or you still remember to this day about like what captivated you and sort of kept you in this community for such a long time?
I think the biggest one was like in the early days, and I was in Bend, Oregon when I started ultra running, and we had a small little group of ultra runners, some older veteran ultra runners at the time, who kind of took us under their wing and mentored us, because there really wasn't anything. I mean, online there was like run100s.com and that was that was the only resource for ultra running at the time. There was there was Ultra Running Magazine, and I started subscribing to that, and I started getting my hands on everything I could, but mainly it was mentorship back then. And that was the cool thing about the community, is some grizzled veteran would take you under his wing and say, oh, this is the route we do at Smith Rock that sandwiches in 5,500 feet of climbing in 20 miles, and you'd be like, what? How much climbing? I thought I was doing a lot of climbing, and then all of a sudden these guys show you like, no, you go up that. And you're like, what? Oh, okay. And so I think that was like a really big influence on me. I come from like the mountain biking scene and was really into the mountain biking scene and climbing scene prior. And it was casual. I raced a little bit on mountain bikes, but it was more casual. I worked at a bike shop in college, was an early adopter of mountain biking. I started riding in the Ozarks in the Midwest in college in like 93. And so I moved west in like 97, moved to Denver in 97, and then kept mountain biking, started climbing. And I think what really attracted me to the sport originally was this community, because back then I was in Oregon. There was the Oregon Ultra Series, because there wasn't all these races there are today. I think there was only 3,300s in the US at the time. Mm-hmm. So there weren't that many, right, in the 2000s. And so it was really a more local regional scene, like Washington, Oregon, and we in Northern California. And so we would road trip to those areas and we'd go to races, and you just you ran the circuit every year. So you ran like Hag Lake 50K, and then you ran Mac Forest 50K. And then there was all the summer races, and like there was a Siskiyou Outback race down in Ashland, and some of the stuff in Washington. And so that was our scene, and you just kept seeing the same people over and over and over, right? And so it became like this extended family that we'd all meet up at these races and hang out. And I was really attracted to that, like the community piece of it and how laid back it was. It reminded me even like more laid back. It was like a combo between climbers and mountain bikers. And I really liked that scene, right? They liked to chill, but they knew how to adventure. And it was taking this whole idea of like light and fast, of the whole idea of climbing and mountain biking and backpacking, and kind of like putting it in a blender. Yeah. And what came out was this like super sweet, like light, fast approach to mountains. And the climbing part of me and summiting things really attracted me to it. The other thing was that mountain biking, you were always limited on what trails you could go on. Because wilderness areas you couldn't go into. You couldn't, if a trail was too technical, you couldn't go up it because you can't ride that kind of stuff. Yeah. Right. But with climbing or with running, it's like scrambling too, right? It can mix in climbing with it. So if you have some climbing skills and you're comfortable with a little exposure, you can go a lot of cool places and link things up. And I think that was like, we used to look at backpacking and go, okay, yeah, I want to do this 40-mile route in 5 days, and all of a sudden you could do it in a day.
Yeah.
And be back for happy hour. So it was like kind of a cool, I like that aspect of trail running.
Yeah.
That's what really attracted me to it.
So at what point did it become more of a competitive outlet for you, Jeff? Because like we were just mentioning, you were somewhat of a late bloomer, and it seems like in the early days, it was just a matter of being part of a community and getting the few finishes and some adventures under your belt. And it wasn't until later that you started to think about it more, at least as like a competitive thing, if not professionally. When did that come about?
I definitely came into it from a casual perspective, but I'm a competitive person. I played all sports in high school, almost went to like a D3 school on a wide receiver scholarship for football. Was super into strength training and an early adopter of strength training, and being in a kind of a gym rat. And then had gotten into mountain biking and found this endurance side of me. And that's where the real, I won the 800 meter in my senior year in high school in track, but I was so focused on football because it was the 80s Missouri, right? It was football, like Friday Night Lights is what it was all about, right?
Hey, how about the Chiefs last night too?
Yeah, the Chiefs, baby.
There you go.
Man, I was stoked. What a game.
Yeah, I almost forgot that you're a Chiefs guy.
Oh, yeah.
Recording the day after the Super Bowl.
Rolling over in his grave right now, man. Like he was, my dad was a diehard Chiefs fan my whole life. Yeah, I mean, where was I going with this? As far as from a competitive perspective, there's a natural competitor in me that I can't turn off. Like even when I'm playing a board game, Yeah. And so one of the things that happened was in 2002. So I ran my first 100 in 2000. I got into the sport in 2001. I ran Western States in 2002. Back then, Montreal Patagonia had a team, and they had like a 3-tiered team. So like the JV team was like, I got onto that with like a sub 24 at Western States, and so I got a jersey and like a couple free shoes a year or something. And I started racing, and I got 5th at Wasatch in 2004. And then when I got 4th at Wasatch, that's when I started going, I think I can run these hundreds better and faster. I might be able to like actually compete in these. So I really started like focusing my training. I started picking up books on training, on endurance training. I picked up Running the Lydiard Way, Arthur Lydiard. I read The Lower Running by Noakes's book. And I kind of started digging into that stuff. And I was a graphic designer, and I was online all the time. So I was researching stuff online. I picked up stuff on like form and cadence and like chi running in the early days in like 2005, and worked on my cadence and my form, and just tried to turn the screws in little spots to try to make myself better, and try to be more intelligent training. And I got into like a periodization thing with a strength coach in the off season in like 2004, 2005 and 2005, 2006, because I'd been having some injuries coming from cycling. You kind of overdevelop your hamstrings compared to your quads, which messes with your knee tracking a little bit. And so I fixed it in the gym in the off season with this personal trainer in Bend. And that's when I won Bighorn in 2005. Back then the competition wasn't super deep, or anything, but I just showed up. I won. I came back the next year, broke Brandon Zabrowski's course record. And then that from that point on, I was like, man, I can do this, like I can win hundreds. So I came back in 2008, won Bighorn again, won Arkansas Traveler, the inaugural Ozark 100, because I was from Missouri.
I remember reading your blog about that Ozark race when I was sort of coming into the sport, and you were one of my
blog, man. That was the
blogs,
thing.
That was the best, man. I mean, it is funny to hear you describe that era, sort of the few years before I even came into the sport, where it was really hard to find any information about where races were, et cetera. It's almost like pre-internet, right? Like way before Ultra Sign Up became the catalog of record, where you could just scroll endlessly and find innumerable adventures around the American West. And I mean, I think it's also interesting to hear you maybe talk a little bit more about like the evolution of things professionally. I think, having been at Western States in 2002 and using that as sort of the representation of world-class racing now, I'd love to get sort of a meta commentary from you about the last 2 decades in the sport. Like, what has you excited about this modern era? And maybe conversely, what annoys you or what do you miss from those early days?
Well, the early days were really cool because it was just super laid back. Like you could get in any race the week before the race. Like there weren't lotteries. I mean, Western States was the only lottery. And I mean, when I got in the lottery in 2002, it was a 50% chance of getting in. Like
they had that. Remember, they had that 2-time loser policy too. So if you missed on the lottery twice, you were automatic the third year.
Third time.
Now there's people who go to the lottery who missed like 8 or 9 years in a row before they finally get in. Those poor miserable people. Keep going.
So that was like really. That was the one cool aspect because you could just kind of show up and there were a lot less races. So you saw a lot of the same people at the same races. So the community was smaller. The race scene was smaller. So, it was definitely grassroots. And I really, that was a cool aspect of the sport. But for me, I mean, competition makes you rise to the occasion. Mm-hmm. And so there is a beauty in the evolution of where we've come. I know some old timers will like get annoyed with some of that, but you know what? Everything changes and we have to learn to evolve with it. And I think the cool thing about the sport now is we know a lot more. We still don't know everything. We're still learning. That's what's really cool about the sport is we're still like, there's so much data that we're like kind of trying this and trying that. And, high mileage, low mileage, more vert, balance vert, like what do we do when we're training for these mountain races and how do you get better at them? So for me, it's really been cool evolution because it's made me really have to like fine tune how I train and train more intelligently. And that intelligent training led me to coaching and which changed my whole career. I was a graphic designer for 20 plus years, had my own business in Bend for 17 years and then started a coaching business. And now that's my thing. I do coaching is my full-time thing. I don't even do design work anymore. And so for me, I'm in it every day. I'm talking about performance. I'm talking about how do I help a guy that's 62 years old or a woman that's 55 to like, maybe some people are going to come to me for like, oh, I'm trying to beat the cutoffs. And some people are coming to me to try to, win their age group or just try to get better and faster and not throw up all the time or something, And so that everybody's a puzzle. And I think that's what's cool about this sport is this, we're still seeing this growth of like the bell curve still going up. And it's been fun for me personally, just because it became kind of a professional pursuit. And if it hadn't grown to that point, I wouldn't have the career I have today. And I appreciate that. Like I'm not lost on that fact that we have to go here if there's going to be things like a professional coach, right? That's going to coach people all over the world remotely. It's pretty awesome, right? That I get to tap into a big group of people all over the globe and get to know them really well and get to help them, go after whatever goal is important to them, whether that's just finishing or just running their first 50K or running their, 20th 100. Just running it better. So it's been fun for me, and it's really been a cool thing to see. And the performances are like sometimes mind blowing, man.
They really are.
I mean, your Hard Rock year is a perfect example, dude. That's why I came up to you after the race and was like, dude, like any other year, you would be the man. You had one of the best performances in history.
Thank you, dude.
But there was one guy in front of you.
Yeah, one of the all-time greats. No shame in that. Hey, by the way, I saw you got off the wait list this year. I'm fourth right now. So
I know you are.
You'll get in next to each other.
We're going to be standing next to each other in Silverton.
I'm planning on it. Hey, so before we talk more about your running career, you just mentioned your design career, and I'd love to explore this a little bit. I'm reading Rick Rubin's book right now about creativity. And I'd love to hear sort of like what role creativity has sort of played in your life throughout time as a designer. And I know like your wife is a creative person too. And so maybe like how your creative outlets have augmented or supported your running endeavors.
Well, I think the creative thing is it's so hard to me that it's even hard to like step outside myself and like analyze it. You know what I mean? But I have always thought outside the box, always have been quick to try all kinds of things. Just try it. Nah, that didn't work. Oh, I'll take a little piece of that, right? Try something. Even if I even have the problem sometimes if, the old saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Like I still have the problem of sometimes I'll have things that aren't broken, but I'll go try to fix them still because I get bored with what I'm doing and I want to try something new. I might want to try new nutrition for a season. And then I have all these problems for a half a season. And then I'm like, go back to what I was doing and everything clears up and I'm fine, or whatever it is. So I think the creative process for me, it's always been, a part of who I am from a young age. My mom was creative and I'm a fine artist. And I was always kind of pushed into that role as it just naturally on the side, rainy days, if I wasn't out in the mud, I was drawing at the kitchen table. And my wife and I met in art class in college. So we've both been very creative. She was an intricate part of my graphic design business as a copywriter and editor. And she's always been like kind of my rock to bounce things off of. And, she still helps me with like some of my writing and looking it over and even my social media posts sometimes. Definitely she edits them. It's like, oh, you have a run-on sentence. You need to go fix that. At some point, I just gave her like access to my Instagram so she could go. So if I was on the road and I posted something and she saw there was a problem, she could just go in and edit it and fix the punctuation real quick.
My wife has full access to all those things also. Thank goodness.
So, like that's always been a part of us. So, when it comes to the design or ultra running side of the things, I like trying things. I like thinking of how to like fix a problem. I like the puzzle. Yeah. And so for me, like every person that comes to me is a puzzle and I need to figure them out and try to, fine tune whatever's going on with them uniquely. And I think that's really speaks to the creative process. It keeps me super engaged. I'm always stoked on it and I love it. I actually love it more than the design years because one of the things that happens with graphic design and marketing, because design goes a lot in branding and all that I was in and user experience, user interface, UI, UX, design for web and mobile and all those things. One of the things that always was annoying to me about that industry is one, the technology always changes. So you constantly have to be like on what's new and improved and the new software and whatever, right? And the other thing I think that's hard about that, if you're a creative person, especially if you're a creative person who likes to go like search for truth all the time, which that's who I am. It's really hard to work for someone who you don't care about their service or their product. It's really hard. It's a little bit soul sucking to go, okay, I need to go take my brain power and learn about this business that I'll never use. I probably wouldn't support in the first place, but I need a paycheck.
Yeah.
And so that part of the business, it's great when you have a client that you want to work for, like Foot Zone in Bend, Oregon, like Teague, when he used to own it. Like I helped him brand for 17 years and did a bunch of design work for all his branding stuff. And I love that because that was my jam, a specialty running store that was community driven and then also sponsored a bunch of events. It was just such a fun scene. Right. But then I also had other clients in that town that I was like, I don't want to work for them. Yeah. But you need a paycheck and you got to put food on the table. So some of that was a little soul sucking. So I definitely don't miss that part of the business. And in ultra running, you're just talking to people about running and trying to help them improve their life and be healthier, lose weight, maybe get stronger, longevity. I mean, obviously I'm a big proponent of mobility, strength, and longevity,
Yeah.
and nutrition as supporting your ultra running. And that's because that's been such a big thing for me. And I think that's one of the things, the key pieces, the other things besides running training is what really helped me to stay in the game so long, and perform. And so I love sharing that because it's fun to share.
I'm going to have you share some of that here in just a little bit. But I love this idea that there's a certain artistic quality to the coaching relationship too, and that it is a constantly ever evolving tinkering that you're doing in support of something that you actually are passionate about, rather than creating a brand icon and typography for some business that you hate or that you wouldn't normally support. So aligning your activities with your values is obviously a really important thing. So you just mentioned the word longevity, and I was listening to a Rich Roll podcast with Garrett McNamara last week. It's a fantastic episode if you haven't listened to it yet. But Garrett McNamara, I sort of view as like a Jeff Browning analog in the surfing community, because he sort of achieved notoriety and success at a time when most athletes are starting to wind down. And one of the things he said in the podcast is differentiation has longevity. In other words, carving out your personal niche within a niche, within a sport, within an industry, in this case, surfing, in his case, running in yours. And I figured maybe this would be an interesting thing to have you talk about too, of just like cultivating a personal brand, as somebody who's worked in design and brand, and like having the differentiation. And then maybe we'll use this as a launching off point to talk about longevity, but talk about like building a brand for yourself and building a niche and a differentiation for yourself within the sport.
Well, I think once I started having, or continue to have some success in my mid to late 40s and going into my 50s, I really started, well, not only I thought about it, but I also had a lot of like people in my extended circle who started speaking to it too, to me, like putting it in my ear saying, dude, you're still performing at your age. And you're like, there's not very many people doing that. Like, this is like, you need to be talking about that. And I'd already been thinking about that and saying, okay, one of the things you are trying to figure out when you're an athlete and sponsored, you're trying to say, how do I stay relevant, as I age? And at some point you have to accept that the aging process happens and you're going to slow down. And how do you evolve your brand into, because if you're an athlete, if you're a sponsored athlete, you're a brand, whether you like it or not, you have to accept that you are a brand. And, that was just a natural thing, the way I think about Jeff Browning, the athlete, as a brand. And so because I have to present that brand to all these brands who I want to get sponsored by, right, or who I want to align with and want me to support me. And so I think that was a natural piece, the longevity piece, as it kind of unfolded itself naturally. I kind of embraced that piece and started to talk about it, because at some point other people are talking about it.
Sure.
So I might as well talk about it too. And I think too, people want to know, what are you doing, right? Why are you still performing at 51 and beating guys that could be legitimately your son? That are 22 or 23 years old or 28, and I'm still a lot older than them,
Yeah.
And I think for me, like, I just started to look at the strength training and the nutrition. The nutrition was probably the biggest game changer for me. Everybody uses the word game changer, but I legitimately, if I was going to use one aspect of my life that I tweaked in end of 2015, beginning of 2016, was the nutritional approach to my endurance stuff. And it was just such a
I remember when we went running in Courmayeur, we were talking about this up at the Refugio Bertone just above Courmayeur, and you were telling me how you like lost 8 pounds immediately and obviously had all these other fantastic physical improvements based on this tweak of your diet. Of course, it's also, been met with a lot of controversy, as all these things are when it comes to diet. It's sort of like religion and politics and things that like you don't bring up in dinner
Totally,
parties.
especially in our circle. When you start talking about restricting carbohydrate, it's like the carbohydrate zealots come out, man. So
yeah, one of the other things we talked about, and this may be like more relatable, and it's certainly something that's front of mind for me right now and relevant in my life, is alcohol consumption. Because you were telling me about how, obviously that was part of your metamorphosis. I mean, alcohol and beer and wine is like a ton of carbohydrates. What is your relationship with alcohol at this point? And especially as an aging athlete, like how has that evolved over time?
Well, I used to be a pretty big like IPA, pale ale beer drinker. And I love beer, but when I made this shift, I've cut out grains and sugar in my everyday diet. I still had, I'm still having carbohydrates. I'm still having fruit and potatoes and stuff like that, but and vegetables, but I was cutting out like grain-based stuff. So if you go within like the paleo circle, so let's call it paleo just for a loose term.
Sure.
Right. But we can call it ancestral, we can call it paleo, we can call it whatever. Right. But really at the end of the day, we're going for nutrient dense foods. That number one, real food, nutrient dense foods. And we're avoiding grains, sugar, and seed oils in our everyday life. So when I started to have to make those tweaks, I quit drinking for a little short window when I first did it. But then, my wife and I we belong to a wine club at a wine bar downtown they have wine tastings once a week. That's our date night. And we like to drink, socially and casually. I don't go get wasted or anything, but I like to have a couple drinks. And so, naturally in that circle, the kind of the direction that you're kind of mentored in, if you get into that kind of scene, is that you drink. Number one choice is clear liquor. So whether that's tequila or gin or vodka or like hard kombucha now that we have, or white wine before red wine, but wine's fine too, right? Because it's fruit based and not a wheat base or something like that. So that's really what we did, is we already drank wine at the time. We just became more of a wine drinker and mixed drinks than we did.
So cutting out the grain-based alcohols. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the beer became more of a special occasion, because I even tell my athletes that I coach, like 90-10 rule or 80-20 rule, right? Yeah. 80% of the time you're on the straight and narrow, right? You're like doing the right stuff from the right food list. But the rest of the time, like, leaves time to have fun. Like, I like Pizzicletta here in town in Flagstaff. Yeah. They have a sourdough crust on their pizza at Dark Sky. And the brewery has a good pale ale, which I love pale ales. I miss pale ales. I don't miss IPAs, but I miss pale ales. And so they always have a good pale ale. And so, every once in a while, like once a month or twice a month, we'll take the family and the kids downtown and we'll like go to Dark Sky and we'll have family dinner, and I'll have a beer or two, and my wife will have a beer or two. She likes IPAs and hazy IPAs. And so like, we just don't sweat it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And
well, good. This is
with it.
Yeah. I'm more just like interested in the volume of consumption over time, because this is very much something that now as a dad, I'm just kind of like trying to get a feel for other people's habits and patterns with consumption, especially people who are high performers in other aspects of their life, professionally, athletically, and things like that. I don't want to
try not to drink Monday through or Sunday through Wednesday. So Thursday night's date night, and then it's Friday, Saturday night. So
come on,
it's weekend, and I just did a long run on Friday usually. So like Friday night, everything's all right, man. Yeah. So like hard kombucha as soon as I get home from my long run. So
cool. Well, yeah, I don't want to get bogged down in the nutrition stuff. I know it's really benefited you personally, what you do, and all the power to you. And I'm not informed or educated enough or really interested to sort of, poke holes or discuss it really at any length. I mean, I think you're obviously a great example of longevity. And so maybe going back to that, differentiation is longevity, right? And like, you've obviously differentiated yourself, and you are just the human embodiment of performance and longevity over time. And so I'd love you mentioned sort of like, the mobility and strength. So maybe before we get to that, let's start with the psychological side of things, because I think it's even more remarkable that you've remained interested in performing at a high level for 20 years in this sport. So maybe if you could talk about what's kept you motivated for such a long period of time, especially as you've grown and matured and become a dad and have all these other professional things going on. What's kept you so interested in trail running?
Well, I think that the training for me, because I sit at a computer, I stand at a computer, and I have since I was in my 20s. I've been in front of a screen a majority of my week, and it's very unnatural, but it's part of the gig, right? And so you have to make your bed there, right? So for me, my lunch or evening or whenever I go run every day, usually lunch during the week, it's my break in the middle of the day. And I made that a lifestyle habit. I carved out, on my Google Calendar, since I've been a beta user in Google in 2005, I started putting a blocked out lunch for 2 hours that no one could put a schedule appointment in there. And I couldn't schedule an appointment in there because it's already blocked out. I made time to train, and that training, because of where I lived, Bend or Bozeman or Flagstaff or wherever, it's always been good trail access right out the door. Like, I can be on dirt in 7 minutes from my house out of my neighborhood. And so growing up in the woods and growing up on a farm, like there's a connection with nature that we just don't have growing up in an urban center. And I think that's very unfortunate for kids today that they don't have that connection. But for me, I need that every day. I need that boom, like just woods, like no houses, just can cruise, find my flow every day at lunchtime, let my brain go where it wants to go. Sometimes I listen to podcasts, and when I need a motivator and I'm like, I don't really want to, I'm like kind of procrastinating on my training run, I just find a podcast and I go listen to it and cruise aerobic, Yeah. But then there's other days where I'm super stoked to be out there and not listen to anything. And I think the training piece for me has always been like what motivated me. I love the trajectory towards a goal, right? Mm-hmm. So like, not the goal itself. The goals are important, but they aren't the end all be all. If you're just focusing on the goals, you're going to be let down because you're going to go do it. And then you're going to be depressed for like a month afterwards.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But if you can find joy in the process as you're heading toward that goal, I think that's a really important piece of like long-term longevity and long-term stoke, right? Is this like it's the process of training.
Yeah.
And I like to run hard, man. I like to taste pennies. Like that's what Rob Carr said on his like Instagram before this uphill challenge. He goes, let's go taste some pennies. When you taste metal when you're running at altitude as hard as you freaking can.
Yeah.
And you're like that slobber coming out of your mouth, but you're still pushing. Like there's
therapy, man. Those are the religious experiences.
It is. It's so awesome. We were built to go hard every once in a while.
How about like with being a dad? I mean, you're a father of 3. I mean, I have to admit that, man, the last 6 months for me have been really hard. Like, you've been a self-employed person also for the last 20 years, call it, also being a high level athlete and a father of 3. It's like, I'm in that boat now, but a father of 1, and I can hardly carve out the time. Was there ever a moment where you sort of lost touch with that love of getting out the door at lunchtime every day? Or
dude,
do you
have
any
tips? Bro, like I can't sit still. I need it. It's my therapy.
Okay.
I mean, I was that kid who was literally like spazzing all the time, like foaming at the mouth. Like today they would have put me on drugs, in a public school.
Yeah.
But I was high energy. My 11-year-old is that way. Abraham is like my blood brother when it comes to that, my little one. He's my runner. He loves to run. He likes to go do crazy stuff. We just skied this morning. And he's got stoke. And you can't coach that. Right? They either have it or they don't, right? When you're a coach and you can have a talented athlete, but if they don't have the stoke and the drive, then they're never going to perform at but I'd rather have a mediocre athlete who has stoke, right?
Yeah.
Who wants to train, wants to do it, work hard, let's do it, you know? And I think I was that kid. I was always working hard, like always working hard. Like when we were doing wind sprints in track or in football, like I'm trying to beat everyone to the line, you know? Yeah. And so for me, I think that it's really easy to like, it's easy for me. It's easy for me to get out the door and do all that. And I actually kind of forgot what our question was there, where we were going.
Well, just like balancing all of it. And I mean,
right. Kids. Okay.
Yeah.
During the early years were the hardest.
Yeah.
I worked from home. I had little kids in the house. I was trying to train and I was trying to perform. And I sometimes ran at crazy hours. Like I would go out the door with a headlamp at 11 o'clock at night and go run with my dogs at 11 to 12:30 and then go to bed. Come home, make some food, go to bed, get up in the morning, work, run it, maybe get a short run in at lunch. I mean, even people have asked my wife, like, how did he do it when you had little kids in the house? And she's like, I didn't even really notice. He did it at such crazy hours that he was always around. And that's because I was self-employed during that time. Like I started my own business in 2001 and have been self-employed ever since. So 2001 was when I did my first ultra, was 01. So those 2 years kind of came together. And so I naturally carved out, after we had kids, I realized that I needed to be around on the weekends. Like Saturdays and Sundays were family. Okay. So I could squeeze in an hour run or something on the weekend. And maybe one of those days were my rest day and one day was an hour maintenance run. But I made Fridays my long run. And in the early days when I was really busy with a graphic design business, I was up at like 5 a.m. I was like first light. I was at the trailhead and I was doing my long run and I was back by lunchtime or 1 o'clock. And then I would work in the afternoons until 5 or 6 on a Friday. And that's what I did. And I worked nights during the week to make up for that Friday morning. So I would work like 8 o'clock to 11 o'clock, 2 or 3 nights a week.
So basically you just made it work. You just didn't have any excuses and
I didn't, man. I just carved it out. And I actually have to admit, as a graphic designer, one of the things that you do is you don't like working during the day is hard during the business day because people are emailing you, calling you. Hey, can you meet for coffee? I need to talk to you about a project. So you're like,
that interrupts the creative flow too.
Yeah, you need a block of time to work. And so I naturally found that 8 o'clock to midnight as after the kids were in bed, I'd hang out with the kids in the evenings, right? I never worked out in the evenings when the kids were, there was all those like years of like, everybody's doing the group run at 5:30. I didn't go to those anymore. I just trained solo at lunch or early in the morning, one or the other. Usually for me, it was lunch because I was staying up late.
Yeah.
So I trained at lunch and then I was back in front of my computer until about 5. And then I would like be with the family until the kids were ready for bed, especially when they're little. They have a very strict bedtime or fairly strict until the teens. And then they're up till midnight. But like during that time at 8 o'clock, I was back in my studio. But for me, it was cool time because I was like tunes on, jamming, working on a design project, and so like, it was a cool time for me. Like I liked those 3 or 4 hour blocks every week. So it was easy to justify taking off on a Friday.
Yeah. Okay.
To go do a big adventure. And then I just mixed in training. I never did back-to-back hard runs during that time anyway. I mixed my training in throughout the week and I might do a double somewhere else during the week or one other longish run. But I would get injured back then coming from cycling and I just didn't have the base in those early years when my kids were young. So I couldn't handle that kind of training anyway.
So, well, that's cool. And it's inspiring. And I'm now newly committed to my own training after achieving maybe my career worst fitness level over the last couple of months. So thank you for the inspiration.
The first year is really hard. And I would even what people have told me. 4 years because they're so hands-on, man. The kids at that age, they're like, when they're 2 or 3, they'll run right off a cliff and not even know it. But you're like, you got to be on them. like their shadow.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
It
it's
is.
just crazy.
It's really fun. Yeah. Never ending source of entertainment and joy and love, obviously. And I just
Now it's way easier.
I just
now.
need to figure my patterns out, to make sure that I am carving out the time necessary to go have that personal alone time out in the woods that we all know is so magical. Jeff, I'd love to also hear you talk about quitting, because I think one of the things that I really admire about you is that in the course of 150 or 200 ultra races at this point, you think you've only dropped out maybe twice in your career.
I have 2 DNFs.
And I think it was like not until your 15th year in the sport that you had your first DNF. I think you rolled your ankle at UTMB, I recall. So talk about that a little bit, just sort of like to what you attribute your remarkable, astronomical success rate of just getting to the finish line, let alone how consistent and successful you've been.
Well, I mean, in the early days, I created this mindset, just my own personal deal with myself. And that was, you're taking time away from your kids and your wife to go spend 15, 20 hours a week chasing this thing that you aren't getting paid for, right? Mm-hmm. At the time, wasn't getting any money, right? Some free shoes and a jersey, right? But that's it back then. And I was just chasing this I was chasing this passionate thing that I was crazy about. And my wife kept reminding me, it's a freaking hobby, dude, chill out. And I couldn't shut it off. And so I made this deal with myself that said, okay, you're only out besides not making a cutoff, obviously.
Yeah, right.
But that wasn't an issue in the early days. It was injury or life-threatening. There's only 2 outs. Injury, life-threatening. You don't get to drop otherwise. Buck up and figure it out. Because you took time. And the other thing, as a dad, as a younger, at the time, younger kids in the house, I started making these little conversations with myself saying, what does that teach your kids? So when it gets hard, you just quit? What kind of lesson is that? Just because it isn't going exactly how I thought it was going to go, or I'm not performing at the level I thought I would perform at? Because that's the thing that's probably the most annoying about elites in my book, is that everyone just drops, and I hate that. Because for me, it was what am I teaching my kids? Oh, I just dropped. Now I understand we're getting paid these days. And sometimes it's well, I wasn't performing today, so I'd rather just save my legs for a different race. Right. So that makes sense. I mean, there is some argument there to be had. Right. And I would argue that I kind of went there with Western States in 2021, where I blew my quads up, but I was also worried about rhabdo, honestly, because my quads were so tender. I'd never experienced that before. And so there was a little bit of that message in the back of my head saying, this could be slightly an injury. You don't want to, you don't want to ruin your career either. And so, because your kidneys can't handle, your liver is really resilient. Your kidneys are not, right? So and so I just, those are my only 2 drops because of that kind of pact with myself. Mm-hmm. I just didn't want to be a bad example to my kids.
I mean, it's amazing that in 150 or 200 ultras, you've only dropped out twice. And yeah, I mean, it was UTMB in 15 or 16, I think, where you rolled your ankle, and then Western States in 2021. 2 of the biggest stages in the sport, unfortunate places to have your DNFs.
Oh, dude.
Man, I mean, it does set a good example, not only for your kids, but for people like me and for the generation behind me too, of just seeing Jeff Browning, who can still compete into his 50s and who doesn't give himself any excuse to just drop out because he's having a bad day, which you almost never have anyway. So,
I figured that piece out, man. The puzzle piece, I kind of know what to do.
You're a freaking tactician, bro. So going back to this longevity piece, we talked about the mental side. The physical side, I'd love to have you just preach about a little bit. And specifically, you mentioned tasting pennies. You mentioned mobility. You mentioned strength training. So if you can tie those three ingredients into a special formula and like a 2 or 3 minute response to just sort of give your personal routine on intensity, strength training, mobility, and what benefit you've seen in terms of your own personal longevity.
Well, mobility is a huge one. I think you have to start with mobility because movement matters. Like your movement patterns need to be really, really good, because if they aren't good, then your strength training is going to suck, because you're going to be actually exacerbating bad movement patterns with weights. So you can't go there, right? So you have to assess your movements first to make sure, can you squat, and do you have enough like ankle flexion to like, get your butt back and drive your butt back, and your make sure your big toes are pointed straight ahead like headlights, and they aren't, one foot's not going out to the side when you do it, or you're rolling an ankle so you can get ankle flexion to like make up for a bad movement pattern. There's all these little things like knees over toes guy. Like that's a really good example of like, we should all be looking at him and what some of his moves, like incorporating those things. And so like some yoga.
He's a wizard. People should follow him on Instagram. And he's got a remarkable way of articulating
some of his moves.
Yeah. He's got a beautiful way of articulating the benefit of all these little subtle exercises that he does. Totally, keep going on mobility, intensity, strength.
So mobility first, then strength, because strength is going to help you, especially as you age, because we naturally lose muscle mass after the age of 35, about a pound a year. So if you're not replacing it, or all we're trying to do is maintain our muscle mass, not because I haven't got any bigger. I lift, twice a week with weights, and I do 2 days a week of a body weight, more mobility type stuff, and kind of some daily mobility moves. But like those things are just keep maintaining my current muscle mass, so I don't just lose it. So I need good movement patterns. I need to be strong. I need to be powerful. Those two pieces kind of go hand in hand, mobility and strength. Those two have to go together, but mobility, I would say, is the foundation, because you need those good movement patterns. Then we can bring on speed, because then you can handle the speed. You don't have bad movement patterns, so you're not overstriding. You're not like one side you're pushing off of harder than the other. Now, we all have imbalances. We all have weak sides. That's natural. I do too. And I have little intricacies and unique things that I'm constantly fighting and having to extra foam roll or go to a masseuse for, or whatever, ART, or get a needling, from time to time. But if we're addressing those three key pieces, you do have to have that big aerobic base, right? To be able to handle speed. So you can't handle speed without your big aerobic base, but you also can't handle speed without good movement patterns. Yeah. So when you have all those things together, as you age, you come into your older time, like I am now. I was an early adopter of strength training, was kind of into muscle and fitness and bodybuilding in the 80s and just following it. That was my introduction to like protein and high protein and that kind of stuff to build muscle and how to build muscle. And one of the things that I think that came out of all that was that if you can keep your muscle mass when you're in your 20s and 30s, you can maintain that with strength training into your 50s and 60s, your physique won't change a lot. Like you're going to get wrinkly, right? Yeah. Because that's natural, right? You lose your collagen and that kind of stuff. And you're going to get the typical, lines and crow's feet in your eyes and all the other things goes along with aging. But from a muscle mass perspective and a powers perspective and how strong I am, yeah, I'm still as strong as I was when I'm stronger now than I was at 35. Yeah. And I would argue better movement patterns than I did at 35.
And you look amazing still, man. Like you look the exact same when I met you way back in the day. Dude. I feel like I look
close enough. There's a lot more white and there's a lot more wrinkles. But I mean, overall, I still have the good physique, right? I still have muscular. Yeah. I haven't lost my muscle. I'm not getting skinny fat. That you see a lot of runners in their 50s and 60s and even 40s. They start to lose their muscle mass because they don't have a routine to maintain what they're naturally using. Yeah. And that's what we need. We have to have that. I think the crazy thing about endurance sports is we've been really, really, all endurance sports have been slow to adopt strength training practices. Every other pro sport has. They embrace weights.
Mhm.
We have this weird thing where we're like, I don't want to get bigger, or I should just take that time to go run. And it's like, well, it doesn't take that much time.
Yeah.
An hour a week total. I have 2 30-minute sessions I do a week.
Yeah.
And then I do some other like mobility and body weight stuff like pull-ups, push-ups, core, and just more mobility like air squats, side lunges, keeping good movement patterns, knees over toes, lunges, that kind of stuff.
Amazing. Well, thanks again for the knowledge and the insight. And I think there's a lot of people who obviously look up to you for what you've been able to do into your, late 40s, now into your 50s. And I certainly am one of those people who now I'll be turning 37 next month. And I want to basically implement the Jeff Browning protocol so that when I'm 51, I'm looking good and still running at the front of a lot of these races around the country and around the world. Jeff, I'd love to hear you talk also about your much anticipated move beyond the 100-mile distance. Of course, you've been well known as the 100-mile master, at least over the course of my time as a participant in the sport. And I think everybody was looking forward to seeing you test out these new 200-mile races. Of course, you smashed it at the Moab 240, bringing the trademark Jeff Browning consistency and success up even longer distance. So maybe tell us, was there anything about that maybe surprised you, that was harder, more challenging, or different than you expected?
Yeah, it's long, man. It's a long way to run, dude. I think the biggest thing was that any little tiny mistakes that you make on day, like the first 24 hours, can kind of really haunt you the last 24 hours of the event. So like, little things like, I had like a heat rash because of a sock fabric choice. Right. And so that was like didn't quite work out, and so like I had heat blisters, and I had to deal with those. And I don't normally have to deal with any foot problems. Like I wear the same pair of socks, same pair of shoes for all of Hard Rock, and then, and I just deal with it. Right. And you might have one little blister at the end, maybe, but my feet are pretty seasoned at this point. So I think that piece and the sleep deprivation piece was really hard, because once you get into day 2, there's such a like my execution of nutrition was affected by my sleep deprivation mind. Like I couldn't remember last time I even took a salt tab, like when I needed to take one with my drink rate. I had this little system with drink rate, and because I wanted it to be so much sodium per liter for me, right? I've been tested in my sodium sweat rate, and I have all these like numbers that I stick to. And I couldn't literally stick to it because your short-term memory, literally, when you're that fatigued, is out the window. So you can't remember, like, was that 15 minutes ago or was that like 2 hours ago? And so I think the sleep deprivation factor was hard. That was I knew it was going to be a factor, but I didn't realize it was going to be that big of a factor. I think the other one is if you have it made me want to work on my foot strength and foot mobility more afterwards, because I had a little bit of like a metatarsal head bruise type, metatarsalgia basically of my right foot. And I was really tender. Like it was like, 9 out of 10 on the pain factor, the last like downhill on Porcupine Rim. Yeah. I remember at one point I looked at Derek Lytle, who was pacing me, and I was like, dude, how far do we have to go? And he was like 7 miles. Oh my God. It was like the longest 7 miles of my life.
I know that trail too. That's an iconic trail in Moab.
It is. It is so hard because there's so much like sandstone. You're on like basically concrete, Yeah. And my foot was just so tender, and I was near tears, and like it was hard. It was really hard. And so, afterwards, my wife was like, I don't think these things are good for you. Yeah. And, just looking at me, what I look like. And I think those were like the biggest surprises for me. And it also made me want to figure them out. Yeah. My natural propensity of like trying to fix the puzzle. Yeah. And so it was kind of cool because it took me to another level on my nutritional side of things, of like my protocol of what I do from a tactical perspective. It really made me, I went into a deep dive in my recovery time after Moab into like a whole nother level of like how I approach drink rate per hour, sodium per liter, like all these little pieces that I tweaked because of that experience.
Yeah.
Had I just kept doing hundreds, I would have never figured that out.
Huh. Okay.
So that was a big one for me. Like the nutritional side of things got even tweaked more.
Yeah.
And it really helped. And it helped me from a coaching perspective, because now the way I coach it is way more like unique and tactical for the individual.
Yeah.
Versus just kind of general recommendations.
Yeah. Awesome, man. Well, I'm excited to see you continue to tinker with that. Maybe someday I'll entertain jumping up in distance, but maybe I'll wait till I'm 51 also. So
it definitely hurts, bro.
Hey, man, I could go absolutely forever with you, and I really would like to do a round two. I know we have to start winding down now because I'd love to go deeper on all this training and racing stuff, but maybe just quickly tell us what you have coming up in 2023, and then we'll close with a couple more philosophical questions.
2023, I'm doing, well, my wife put this in my head. I think it was tactical because she didn't want me to do another 200 this year. So she said, you turn 52 this year and you have 4,600 mile finishes. She goes, why don't you try to equal your age in 100-mile finishes?
Oh my goodness. That means you got to do six.
That means I got to do 600s this year. So I'm in Hard Rock. So I naturally started looking at what's around Hard Rock and the old Rocky Mountain Slam, which is kind of fallen by the wayside. There's no official like award.
Awesome, dude. Awesome.
But I'm doing Bighorn, Hard Rock, Wasatch, Bear. I'm doing the new Sedona Canyons 125 at Cocodona. So the last 125 of the course. That's a new event this year. They added. So I'm doing that in May. And then I just did Coldwater 100 in January. So I just have 5 more hundreds to do. And I can equal it by the end of the season. And I just ran a 50K last weekend or 2 weekends ago. And then I'm going to do a 50 miler next month down, just local stuff, Aravaipa stuff, just for training and fun.
You're such a savage, man. Unbelievable. I have your ultra sign up pulled up here. So since June of last year, you did the Scout Mountains 100, you did the Hard Rock 100, Moab 240, Desert Solstice. In between those, I think you did the Wonderland Trail. Then you did the Coldwater Rumble. And now you got 5 more hundreds coming up this year. I don't know how you do it, bro. You're such an inspiration. It's amazing.
Well, I don't train high miles.
We'll get into that on the next podcast because
we should have a part 2.
That'll open up another totally rich conversation. I'm sure there's a lot of people who would love to hear about, training volume and your philosophy behind that. But I have a couple fun questions that I like to ask people that are maybe, more philosophical and deeper, more revealing of other things that you may be thinking about. Number one is, who's one person who you really admire right now, living or dead? I'm looking over your shoulder at Steve Prefontaine.
Well, it's got to be Pre.
Yeah. Okay.
Prefontaine was like, I just liked his tenacity. Mm-hmm. Like he showed up to work every time. Like his whole time, 4 years at University of Oregon, he never missed a workout.
Yeah.
Like let that soak in. There's a lot of prima donnas today in pro sports, right? I think, what's his name from the Sixers who said practice,
Iverson. Yeah.
Right. Like that's a good example, right? He was like, well, we're talking about practice. Well, he showed up to practice, dude.
Yeah.
Every time he worked hard, and I think he's always going to be iconic because he was taken too early. Right.
Yeah.
So he's a big one for me personally. He's always been kind of like iconic in that, in that endurance world.
Yeah.
I would have liked to seen what if he was old and what he was doing today.
Yeah, man. No doubt he'd be ripping 200-mile races. That's for sure.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, but I think you're right. I think that's one of the things that people really admire about guys like you and like, Zach Miller and stuff is that it's like, it is that blue collar mentality of put the work in and then race hard. No excuses. Let's
leave it on the course.
Exactly. Amazing. Final question for you, Jeff. what's one sort of semi-profound truth you've learned about yourself or life in general through running ultramarathons?
I think that one of the things with ultras that I think is pretty profound is that or I guess what I love about the sport, I should say, is you can't just jump off the couch.
Yeah.
You have to show up. You have to do the work, or you will not make it to the finish line. Especially when we're talking about 100 milers, right? Or beyond. You have to do the work. You can't just show up. You can't just go jump couch to 5K, right? There is no couch to 100. And because you won't make it. One, you'll probably put yourself in some kind of health risk if you did that, right? Whether that's rhabdo or dehydration and hyponatremia or hypernatremia or however you want to cut it, So I think that's probably one of the things that I love about this sport is that it takes consistency and hard work, and it pays consistency and hard work in a lot of dividends. It just keeps paying it too. Because if you're consistent, right? That's why I tell athletes all the time, any one workout doesn't matter. It's the consistency is the king of it all. Yeah. Right. You just show up and put in the work. Show up, even if it's a day where you're like, I don't feel like it. Well, go run easy. Go run zone 1. Take some hike breaks. Listen to a podcast. It doesn't matter, right? Yeah. Listen to the Free Trail podcast, right? And please. and right, and just go cruise and check the box, right? You just show up and do the work every day, and then pretty soon you're like me, 23 years into the sport. And I've trained consistently week in, week out. Even in my off season, I even go into periodization phases. I never take time off. Yeah. I take phases where I do other things. I might ski more. I might bike more. I might lift weights more. I might only run 3 days a week for an hour or less, right? For a phase. But I still am building that aerobic base blocks. Yeah. Always working on aerobic base. And then the other stuff's periodization phases mixed in, whether it's strength, whether it's heavier strength sometimes, whether it's lighter strength, whether it's speed work or whatever, right? It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, consistency is king. Yeah. Do the work. Look at this. We brought it full circle. The first comment question was, growing up on the farm in Missouri, working hard. And now... But I think you also have to bolster a mindset too, right? I think one thing that's really important in this sport is your mind game is just as important as your training. Yeah. It's actually one of the physiologies you have to train, because there's so many very talented runners, but their head gets in the way. Yeah. Right? So true, isn't it? And it derails you. Yeah. And so I think that's another one, is staying in that positive place, knowing that. I'll leave you with this. One last little thing that I like to tell people that I'm teaching the mindset side of things. Yeah. We have something like 60,000 thoughts a day. Okay. For every thought, think of every thought you have as a seed that wants to germinate and sprout. Okay. Now we have negative and positive thoughts all the time. Now, your time is water. So if you spend time on that thought, then you're going to water it and you're going to sprout it, and it's going to become a plant. So we have the negative ones that are going to be these gnarly, I like to imagine them as gnarly weeds with thorns and thistles, and they're going to grab you like a vine and choke you and pull you down. Okay. And then there's the cool flowering fruitful plants. They're the positive ones. So when you have those thoughts, they're both there. You run 100 miler, you're going to experience both seeds trying to germinate, but which one are you going to spend time on and water? If you're going to water those, then it's going to drag you down and choke you, and you're going to probably drop at the next aid station or the next aid station, right? But if you can say, I recognize you, but I'm not going to water you, because it's normal to have both. You're in la la land if you think you're going to have only positive thoughts for the whole race, right? You're going to have a low spot and you're going to have a negative thought. And if you're going to have that, just don't water it. Don't give it time. Say, I recognize you, but I ain't going to give you any time, no water. I'm going to drown. I'm going to starve you out, and I'm going to water something else. And then you got to find, how do I water that other thing? Yeah. Sometimes it's looking around. I pay to do this. Look how beautiful it is here. Sometimes it's giving yourself a pep talk, literally out loud. I've done that at Western States in the middle of the race for the top 10, like pushing the last 60K. And you want everything in you saying, God, let's just slow down, man. Let's just slow down. We're going too fast. And you have to say, no, come on, Jeff, you can do this. Come on. So whatever those tools are that you have to develop over time to help you water that positive thought and make it flower. That's what you want. And I
love it, man. What a perfect metaphor. What perfect visualization too, or just like a great articulation of, or metaphor for, where we place our attention and what manifests as a result. So Jeff, you're an absolute legend, man. So great to have you on the show. We got to do it again.
Yeah. Thanks, bud.